Picture this: a steel gray Moscow afternoon in February 1974. Snow is falling in slow, heavy flakes. A black Volga sedan pulls up to an apartment building. Men in long, dark coats step out. KGB officers, faces blank, eyes cold. They move quickly, climb the stairs, and knock on a door that has been watched for months. Inside, a 55-year-old man with a heavy beard and piercing eyes looks up from his desk piled high with papers. His name is Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn. He has survived almost a decade in Soviet prison camps and exile. He has written books the Kremlin fears more than Western missiles. On that desk, he has been revising a manuscript that no one in the Soviet Union is supposed to read. A book that has already slipped across borders and into printing presses the KGB can't reach. The men at the door present a warrant. He already knows what this means. Hours later, he is stripped of his citizenship, driven under guard to the airport, and forced onto a flight to West Germany. The Soviet Union has decided it cannot afford to keep him inside its borders. It is better, from their point of view, to expel him to the land of their enemies than to let him keep writing inside the land of the workers. For the cameras waiting in Frankfurt, the image is unforgettable. A great power, proud of its tanks and rockets, so afraid of one man's words that it had to put him on an airplane and get rid of him. What made those words so dangerous? And why did they end up landing in a world where, instead of being burned, they were multiplied by typewriters, microfilm, offset presses, photocopiers, radio signals, and bookstore shelves across America and Europe? This is the story of Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn, but it's also a story about technology, information, and the Cold War. It's about how a regime that thought it could control history with police and prisons ended up shocked at what the other side could do with cameras, jets, and printing presses. And it's a story that, for an American audience, should spark pride, fascination, and curiosity, because the tools that helped him bring the truth to the world were, overwhelmingly, on your side of the Iron Curtain. To understand what happened in 1974, we have to go back more than 30 years, to the moment the Soviet Union created its own most dangerous critic. Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn is born in December 1918, in the chaotic aftermath of the Russian Revolution. His father dies before he is born, killed in a hunting accident. He is raised by a devout Orthodox Christian mother in a country that is rapidly trying to erase God from public life. As the new Soviet state consolidates power, churches are closed, arrests are made, and religious belief is mocked in schools. Young Alexander, like many boys in the new system, eventually drifts away from his mother's faith and towards Marxism. He becomes a true believer in the grand Soviet experiment. He studies mathematics at Rostov University, proves talented at abstract thinking, and dreams of writing a sweeping epic novel about the revolution. To him, in those early years, the Soviet Union is not yet the enemy, it is the future. Then comes war. In 1941, Nazi Germany invades the USSR. The conflict that follows is brutal beyond imagination. For Americans, the numbers are staggering. Tens of millions of Soviet citizens die. Cities burn. Entire regions are occupied. The Soviets call it the Great Patriotic War. Solzhenitsyn answers the call. He joins the Red Army, serves as an artillery officer on the front, and proves himself under fire. He is decorated for bravery and rises to the rank of captain. In those years, he is not a dissident. He is a loyal officer of the Soviet state, fighting Hitler's armies with conviction. But even at the front, where death is everywhere, he still thinks, he still writes. He sends letters to a friend, a fellow officer, in which he allows himself small, coded criticisms of the country's supreme leader, Joseph Stalin. Not denunciations, not open rebellion, subtle barbs, ironic nicknames, questions about his competence. In a free country, that kind of private letter might lead to an argument or no response at all. In Stalin's Soviet Union, it leads to prison. The letters are intercepted by Soviet military counterintelligence, SMERSH, whose name means death to spies. To them, any criticism of Stalin, no matter how private, is not a joke. It is anti-Soviet agitation. It is treason in disguise. In February 1945, as the war in Europe is nearing its end, Captain Solzhenitsyn is arrested at the front. One day, he is commanding a battery of artillery. The next, he is in handcuffs. A military tribunal convicts him under Article 58 of the Criminal Code, the infamous clause used to put millions of people in prison for thought crimes. The sentence? 8 years in labor camps, followed by permanent internal exile. In that moment, the Soviet regime manufactures its own worst enemy. It takes a loyal officer and plunges him headfirst into the dark heart of the system it denies exists. The place he is sent has a name that will haunt the 20th century, the Gulag. For most Westerners at the time, the word Gulag means nothing. There is no Wikipedia, no documentaries, no satellite imagery. Behind the Iron Curtain, the Soviet Union presents itself as a society of workers and peasants building a radiant future. There are no news reports about camps. There are parades. Inside those parades, hidden like rot in the beams of a house, is a vast network of prisons and labor camps stretching from the Arctic to Central Asia. Solzhenitsyn will later call it an archipelago, an immense chain of islands of suffering scattered across the map. He arrives in this archipelago first as any other prisoner, in prison trucks, freight cars, overcrowded cells. Then he's shipped to labor camps where men cut timber in sub-zero temperatures, dig canals with inadequate tools, work in mines and construction projects that leave them broken and half-starved. The logic of the system is cruel. Work people to the limit, feed them just enough to keep them alive, and replace them when they die. At one point, because of his mathematical training, he is transferred from a regular camp to a special kind of facility, a sharashka, a secret research institute staffed by prisoners with technical skills. Scientists and engineers there design equipment and systems for the Soviet state, guarded by barbed wire and armed men. The setting will later become the basis for his novel, The First Circle. Even here, in this slightly less brutal environment, he sees what the system really is. Talent is used, but not trusted. Minds are exploited, but not honored. He realizes that the prisons are not a deviation from Soviet power, they are its foundation. When his 8-year sentence is up, he does not go home. He receives a new punishment, eternal exile in a remote village in Kazakhstan. He is sent there with almost nothing. In that dusty place, far from Moscow and the cities he once knew, he works as a school teacher, teaching mathematics to children in a small, poor school. There, he faces another enemy, cancer. He is diagnosed with a tumor and sent to a primitive hospital for treatment. The months he spends staring at ceilings, lying in wards with other patients, wondering whether he will live or die, become material for another of his great novels, Cancer Ward. In the camps and in exile, stripped of his rank, his youth, his health, something crucial happens inside him. He watches people betray each other to survive. He watches others sacrifice themselves to protect a stranger. He sees cruelty and kindness in every camp barrack. He comes to a conclusion that will define his work. The line between good and evil does not run between classes or parties or nations. It runs through every human heart. Through his heart, through mine, through yours. He also reconsiders the faith of his childhood. Watching ideology used to justify every crime, he begins to see his mother's quiet Christianity in new light. The God he once rejected becomes slowly the anchor that allows him to interpret his suffering as something more than random cruelty. This will also shape his writing later. He will attack not only Soviet communism, but any worldview that tries to build paradise on Earth by denying the moral complexity of human beings.
In 1953, Stalin dies. The political climate shifts. In 1956, as part of the new leadership's attempt to distance itself from the worst excesses of the past, Solzhenitsyn is rehabilitated. His conviction is canceled. He is allowed to leave exile. Still considered suspicious, but no longer legally a criminal, he moves to the town of Ryazan and resumes teaching mathematics at a school. He could have tried to disappear into ordinary life. Many Gulag survivors did. But the experience of the camps will not leave him alone. He begins to write seriously again, this time about what he has seen. He writes in secret, at night, hiding his manuscripts in safe places, knowing that if the KGB finds them, he could easily end up back in prison. His first major work from this period is something deceptively simple, a short novel called One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich. It does exactly what the title says. It describes a single day in the life of a prisoner in a labor camp. No big plot twists, no spy story, just the rhythm of work, cold, hunger, humiliation, small dignities, and the tiny victories that keep a man from collapsing. In 1962, the impossible happens. The manuscript reaches the desk of Aleksandr Tvardovsky, the editor of the prestigious Soviet literary magazine Novy Mir. Tvardovsky recognizes its power and sends it, with some trepidation, up the chain. At that moment, Nikita Khrushchev is trying to consolidate his position by denouncing Stalin's cult of personality. He sees in the story an opportunity to show that the new leadership is different. Against all odds, he personally approves its publication. One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich appears in Novy Mir. For Soviet readers, it is like a bomb going off in slow motion. For the first time in the official press, printed on the same paper as patriotic poems and party speeches, they can read a clear, realistic depiction of camp life. For those who have been there, it is shattering and vindicating. For those who haven't, it is a revelation. Everyone in the USSR knows someone who disappeared into that system. Now, at last, its existence is acknowledged in plain language. Outside the Soviet Union, the story is quickly translated and published. It gives the West a glimpse in accessible form of something many suspected but few understood. The Cold War suddenly has a new kind of document, not propaganda, not defector testimony at a press conference, but a short, devastating work of literature that breaks the silence. For a brief moment, Solzhenitsyn is a semi-official author. He is invited to meetings, his name is printed in the Soviet press, but that window closes quickly. Khrushchev is ousted in 1964. Leonid Brezhnev and his allies take over, determined to stop the excesses of the thaw. The system does not want more books about camps. It wants stability. It wants forgetfulness. Solzhenitsyn continues to write. He produces The First Circle, a novel about the Sharashka Research Institute for Prisoners, and Cancer Ward, about suffering and moral choices in a Soviet hospital. These works are too critical, too honest to pass the censors now. Manuscripts are rejected. Editors are warned away from his name. The manuscripts don't sit quietly in a drawer. They begin to circulate as samizdat, typed copies passed hand to hand, read in private, then retyped. They cross the Soviet border in the luggage of diplomats and journalists and are published by Western houses. For Moscow, this is unforgivable. It sees this as handing ammunition directly to the enemy. In 1969, Solzhenitsyn is expelled from the Soviet Union Writers' Union. Officially, it's a disciplinary measure. In practice, it's a death sentence for any sanctioned literary career. No union membership means no access to publishing houses, no invitations to public events, no place in the Soviet cultural hierarchy. At this point, he has a choice: compromise, stay quiet, write harmless things. He chooses war. He begins work on the book that will define his legacy and shake the world's understanding of the Soviet system, the Gulag Archipelago. The name itself is a stroke of genius. It turns a network of camps the Soviet government insists is a series of isolated facilities into a single geographical entity, not scattered accidents, a system. From the late 1950s into the 1960s, quietly, patiently, he has been collecting testimonies from other former prisoners, hundreds of them. Men and women who survived prisons and camps all over the Soviet Union give him their stories. Some write them down and pass him the pages. Others visit him secretly in Ryazan or Moscow, sit in a corner and speak while he takes notes or memorizes. Many of them are terrified. If the KGB finds out they're talking, they could be arrested again. He cross-checks dates, locations, names. He reconstructs the structure of the camp system, from arrest to interrogation, transport, classification, work, punishment, and release. He supplements this with his own detailed memories of prisons, transit camps, and the Sharashka. He is no longer just a novelist, he is building an underground historical investigation. By 1968, the manuscript of the Gulag Archipelago is complete in Russia. It exists in pieces, notebooks, typed pages, bundles hidden in apartments. If the KGB finds even one part, the entire project is at risk. If they find the whole thing, it will be destroyed, and everyone involved will likely end up back in prison. So, he and his small circle of trusted allies create a system that would look at home in a spy thriller. They break the manuscript into parts and hide them in different locations, each under the guard of one person who knows only their piece. They make microfilm copies. A camera photographs every page, producing tiny negatives on rolls of film. Those rolls can be hidden in ordinary objects, sewn into clothing, tucked into the casing of a radio, rolled into the handle of a suitcase.
Conveniently, by the 1960s, the world is full of technologies the original architects of the Gulag never anticipated. Miniature cameras, microfilm, commercial air travel, photocopy machines in Western cities, international mail that, while watched, cannot be completely controlled. One famous story from this phase involves a small transistor radio. On the outside, it's a piece of modern Soviet consumer technology, a symbol the regime likes to show off as proof that it is catching up with the West. Inside, nestled in the battery compartment, someone has hidden the microfilmed pages of Solzhenitsyn's manuscript. An interpreter working for UNESCO, visiting Moscow, agrees to help. He carries the radio out of the country, through customs and border checks, onto a plane, and into the free world. From there, the film is developed, the manuscript is retyped and edited, and publishers in Western Europe prepare it for printing. Another complete copy is sent to a Swiss lawyer to be held in safekeeping. The Swiss banking and legal system, built on confidentiality and stability, becomes an unlikely ally of ex-prisoners from Soviet labor camps. In West Germany, the writer Heinrich Böll, himself a Nobel laureate, carefully reads and signs pages to confirm authenticity, lending his prestige as a shield against the inevitable Soviet claim that the whole thing is a forgery. In 1973, the first volume of the Gulag Archipelago is published in the West, in Russian. Excerpts appear in French magazines and are quickly translated into English and other languages. The book is thick, dense, relentless. It is not an easy read. It is not meant to be. It describes in detail the machinery of repression, arrests in the night, interrogations in basement rooms, fabricated charges, torture, starvation, forced labor in extreme climates. Its most explosive claim is simple, that the Gulag is not an aberration limited to Stalin's paranoia, but a direct product of the system Lenin and his followers built from the beginning. The legal framework for arbitrary arrest and camp labor, Solzhenitsyn argues, was laid down in the 1920s, long before the Great Terror. Stalin did not invent it from scratch. He expanded and intensified what was already there. In the West, the impact is immediate. For millions of ordinary readers, the book confirms the worst suspicions about the Soviet regime and gives them details they never had before.
for many intellectuals, especially in Europe, who had long believed that the Soviet experiment, despite its flaws, represented a sincere attempt at social justice, it is a painful blow. Some cling to the idea that Solzhenitsyn exaggerates. Others reluctantly admit that the crimes of the Gulag are too well documented to ignore. Politically, the book becomes a weapon. Presidents, senators, members of parliament quote it. Human rights campaigns use it to pressure the USSR. In the long, slow war of influence that makes up so much of the Cold War, the Gulag Archipelago is like a tactical nuclear strike in the realm of ideas. Inside the Soviet Union, of course, the book is banned. Possessing even a few pages could mean serious trouble. The state responds with a massive propaganda campaign. Newspapers call Solzhenitsyn a traitor, a liar, a man consumed by hatred. The KGB intensifies surveillance of him and anyone connected to him. But even within the USSR, despite censorship and fear, portions of the book leak back in. Pages are smuggled on microfilm the other way, from west to east, printed secretly, read under blankets by people who already know, from their own lives, that the official version of history is a lie. 3 years before the Gulag Archipelago becomes public, in 1970, the Swedish Academy awards Solzhenitsyn the Nobel Prize in Literature. The citation praises the ethical force with which he has pursued the indispensable traditions of Russian literature. For the USSR, this is an embarrassment and a provocation. They view it as the West meddling in their internal affairs. Newspapers denounce the Nobel Committee. Party organizations call meetings to condemn the anti-Soviet campaign. Solzhenitsyn considers traveling to Oslo to receive the prize, but fears he will not be allowed to return. Given what happens later, that fear is well-founded. He decides not to go. The award is accepted in his absence. His Nobel lecture is smuggled out and eventually delivered by proxy. The award, however, places him under an even brighter spotlight. He is now not just a Soviet internal problem, but an international one. By 1973-74, from the leadership's perspective, the situation is intolerable. The General Secretary and the Politburo gather in those secretive rooms where the fate of millions has often been decided. On the table is the question, what to do about Solzhenitsyn? They have options. They can arrest him again and try him publicly, risking turning him into a martyr. They can quietly kill him and hope to blame someone else. Or they can do something that uses the very technology and global systems they mistrust. They can put him on a plane and send him out, letting the West deal with the consequences. The man driving this decision at the KGB is Yuri Andropov, a name that will later appear again as head of state. He recommends deportation and stripping of citizenship. The Politburo agrees. On February 12, 1974, the KGB knocks on Solzhenitsyn's door in Moscow. He is taken into custody, charged with treason, informing that he is no longer a Soviet citizen. He barely has time to gather a few belongings. His wife, Natalia, begins quickly organizing a parallel rescue mission. She works with contacts to move as much of his literary archive as possible out of the USSR before it can be seized. The next day, he is taken to Sheremetyevo Airport, escorted through, and placed on a flight to Frankfurt. He does not choose the destination. He does not hold a passport. He is technically stateless.
When he steps off that plane in West Germany, cameras are waiting. So are Western officials, writers, and journalists. Among the first to greet him is Heinrich Böll, the German novelist who helped authenticate his manuscript. For millions of viewers who will see his face on TV that week, this is a striking moment. A superpower has just admitted, by its actions, that it cannot defeat one man's words on its own soil. What comes next reveals, even more clearly, the difference between the two sides of the Cold War. In the Soviet Union, Solzhenitsyn was watched, harassed, denied publication, prohibited from travel, publicly slandered, and finally expelled. In the West, within weeks, publishers compete to print his works.
Translators race to get the Gulag Archipelago into more languages. Universities invite him to give lectures. Newspapers print his essays and interviews. All of this happens without a central command. It is the normal operation of a free cultural marketplace, supercharged by 20th century technology. He spends some time in Switzerland, then eventually settles in the United States, in Cavendish, Vermont, a small town surrounded by forests and hills. There, he buys a house and some land, seeking quiet and isolation. It is a striking contrast. The man whose life was once decided by orders from Moscow now lives in a place so small that town decisions are made at local meetings. He writes not under the eyes of censors, but in a study filled with books, with a telephone on the desk, electricity from a grid that doesn't care what he believes, and access to printing presses that will publish whatever he sends. From Vermont, he continues to write prolifically. He completes and revises volumes of the Gulag Archipelago. He works on his long, multi-volume novel cycle, The Red Wheel, about the Russian Revolution. He writes essays that criticize not only Soviet communism, but also the spiritual weakness and materialism he sees in Western culture. In 1978, Harvard University invites him to deliver its commencement address. There, standing in front of graduates of one of America's most prestigious universities, he does something unexpected. Many in the audience expect a straightforward celebration of Western freedom and a condemnation of the Soviet system. He does condemn the Soviet system, but he also turns his sharp eye on the West. He tells his listeners that the West, for all its success, is spiritually exhausted, focused too much on rights and too little on duties, drowning in material comfort, but weak in moral courage. He criticizes the press for chasing sensationalism, the legal system for being overly litigious, society at large for being unwilling to sacrifice or suffer for higher ideals. Some are offended, some are impressed. In any case, his words are printed in full, debated in newspapers, translated and archived. No one confiscates the text. No one is arrested for reading it. In a very real sense, his critique of the West proves his point about its strength. A society that can tolerate and discuss such criticism, even celebrate the speech as a major event, is a society with resilience. Meanwhile, in the Soviet Union, the Gulag Archipelago is not forgotten. It cannot be. For dissidents and underground readers, it becomes a kind of Bible of the system they live under. For officials, it is a sore spot. Even those who publicly dismiss it as lies sometimes privately admit that it captures something true about the machinery of fear they administer. As time passes, a paradox emerges. In the West, Solzhenitsyn is embraced as a symbol of resistance to communism. At the same time, some people grow uncomfortable with his harsh criticism of liberal democracy and secularism. In the USSR, officials condemn him, but his warnings about the moral rot inside the system are borne out by events. In 1991, the Soviet Union collapses. The flag changes. Borders shift. The Gulag system, already scaled back, is largely dismantled. Archives begin to open. Historians dig into the numbers and find that the reality is, if anything, even more complicated and terrible than the picture drawn in the Gulag Archipelago. On the essential point, he was right. In 1994, after 20 years in exile, Solzhenitsyn returns to Russia. His citizenship is restored. He's flown back not as a prisoner, but as an honored guest. He travels through the country by train, meeting people, giving talks, trying to influence the direction of the new Russia. He's not entirely in harmony with the new elites. He criticizes the rapid shock therapy market reforms of the 1990s, denouncing the rise of oligarchs and the selling off of national assets. He argues that Russia needs not to copy the West wholesale, but to rediscover its own roots, local self-government, Christian ethics, a strong moral code. Some see him as a necessary conscience. Others see him as an out-of-touch moralist. He dies in 2008 in Moscow at 89. He is given a state funeral. Leaders who would once have denounced him now praise him as someone who exposed Stalin's crimes and defended the Russian soul. His legacy inside Russia is complex. But there is one area where his legacy is clear and almost universally acknowledged. He made it impossible for anyone, anywhere, to say honestly, "We did not know." From the point of view of the Cold War, his story has a particular resonance for American viewers. At each critical turning point, the technologies that helped him were technologies the Soviet Union tried to control and the West allowed to spread. When Frida Vigdorova took notes in a Soviet courtroom, she relied on pen and paper. When that transcript left the country, it relied on jet travel, Western printing presses, and independent media. When the Gulag Archipelago left Moscow on microfilm hidden in the radio, it relied on the existence of miniature cameras and international air routes, and on a world where Swiss lawyers, German writers, and French editors could do their work without asking permission from a central committee. When the book was published, it relied on offset printing presses, global distribution networks, and a reading public trained by decades of free access to information. When Solzhenitsyn spoke at Harvard, his words traveled instantly via microphones, cameras, and broadcast networks that were not controlled by a party. In World War II stories, we often focus on how German officers were stunned by American material power. Endless lines of trucks, the constant flow of supplies, the sky full of bombers. In Cold War stories, there is a different kind of shock. Soviet officials, raised to believe that controlling a few key levers, radio, newspapers, publishing, equals control of information, discover that they are up against a society where the levers are everywhere, in millions of private hands. They could restrict typewriters. The West sold photocopiers by the millions. They could jam a few radio stations. The West launched satellites and expanded shortwave broadcasting. They could stop one book from being printed at home. The West turned that book into an international bestseller, translated into dozens of languages, taught in schools, quoted in parliaments. They thought they could contain one man's testimony by isolating him. The West took that man, gave him a house in Vermont, and surrounded him not with guards, but with technology and institutions that multiplied his voice. For Americans, there is a particular kind of pride in that. Not a triumphalist, chest-thumping pride about missiles and warheads, but a quieter pride in the way your society's openness, infrastructure, and habits of free inquiry turned out to be a strategic advantage. There is fascination, too, in the details. The radio with microfilm in its battery compartment, the woman in a Soviet courtroom who wrote faster than fear, the Swiss safe deposit box holding pages that could get people killed, the offset press in Paris or New York humming at night, spitting out pages that no censor could confiscate because the censors were on the wrong side of the border. And there is curiosity, because if this is what happened with one man and one book, how many other stories of scientists, engineers, artists, and thinkers followed similar paths? How many Soviet physicists ended up working in American labs, using American equipment to push boundaries their own government constrained? How many Eastern European coders helped build the American software and internet systems that would later make censorship even harder worldwide? How many people labeled enemies of the people by one regime ended up engraved on plaques and book spines in another? Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn's life doesn't answer all those questions, but it points the way. It shows that the Cold War wasn't only about which side had more tanks or bigger warheads, it was also about which side could move ideas faster, further, and more freely, which side trusted its citizens with the tools that make copying and sharing almost effortless. In that contest, the side with the free presses, the global airlines, the Xerox machines, the independent universities, and the open bookstores had an edge that no amount of secret police could neutralize. The Soviet Union tried to hide its gulag behind walls of secrecy and lies. Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn, armed only with memory, courage, and the technologies of a free world, tore down those walls page by page. And that is a victory Americans can claim as their own, not because they controlled him, but because they didn't have to. Because when he arrived on their shores, all they had to do was what their system already did best: turn one man's story into something the whole world could read.